Welcome everyone to Citizen Climate Lobby Canada's education call for April 2020. It's April 30th, and tonight we have on our call Doug Pritchard. Doug is the coordinator for Toronto East, and he is also a Climate Interactive ambassador, and he is going to introduce us to the Climate Interactive En-ROAD Simulator. He's an engineer and he's been with us a long time, and I really appreciate that he has taken this time to share this wonderful simulation model with us. It's all yours, Doug.
Okay, thanks, Kathy. Thanks for the opportunity. We'll try and keep the call to an hour, so that's a time frame for you. And I'd like to introduce a couple of folks that are helping me, who are also Laura Lindberg. You want to wave to the crowd, Laura? Is a member of the Toronto Downtown Group, and Chris Hitchcock is another person working with the Climate Ambassador Program. So they're going to help me with some of the tech work tonight. And the first thing I want to say is this is a really strange time. As we had a bit of chat gathering about how busy some people are and how crushingly bored other people are. There's lots of financial concerns in households. There's lots of homeschooling being learned and exercised as well. So it is a very strange time. And for our country, our members of parliament and other legislators are completely preoccupied with helping constituents access financial benefits and trying to forecast how and when we move forward as a country, balancing those risks and demands. But any crisis also brings opportunities, and as we move out of this crisis and return to acknowledging the other crisis in the climate, we want to be prepared to think about it. So I appreciate you folks taking the time out of a stressful life to be a part of this conversation tonight. Probably lots of you are familiar with Zoom controls, but just to mention a couple of things.
Okay, and I've got a...
So we will be using the chat room for most of your responses. So I will be asking some questions and asking for some feedback, and then ask you to use the chat room for that. And Laura's going to monitor that and feedback, summary answers to questions I'm putting. So please find the chat room down there in the bottom bar and be ready to use it. And you can address it either to Laura personally, Laura Lindberg, or to the group as a whole. The chat will be saved as part of the record of this meeting. So the links that we're going to put into the chat for you, you don't have to copy them down. They'll be part of the record that you can access later. I guess the first thing I'd like to ask you is just your level of familiarity with the En-ROAD simulator already. So I've got a little poll here, and if you could respond to this poll right now as to how familiar you are with the En-ROAD simulator, that'll help me focus the remarks from here. So I need to launch the poll. There you go. So you should have that poll on your screen, and give me your answers. So it's looking like a couple of people are quite familiar with it, some more a bit familiar, but it looks like the large majority are not familiar with it at all. Okay, that's helpful for me, so I'll make sure that I address it for folks for whom this is quite new. So to tell you a little about En-ROADS as an organization, En-ROADS Interactive, or the Climate Interactive Group, teamed up with MIT Sloan School of Management to put together this simulator. They had an earlier version of it, and it's now been launched again with a new version in January of this year. And they've made it available for free. They have substantial foundation funding for it, and so they're able to make it available free. So I think it's a real blessing for everyone involved and concerned about climate issues. The model itself is made up of 15,000 equations, economic equations, scientific equations, physics, and it simulates the interactions, particularly amongst different aspects of the economy, sources of energy, population growth, sources of greenhouse gas emissions, and looks at all of those as a dynamic system. That's kind of the difference of this simulator with other things like, some of you may be familiar with Project Drawdown, which looks at climate policies one by one and what the maximum potential cost-benefit analysis would be. This model is different because it's taking a lot of these things and putting them together in one dynamic model, and so you've got the interactions. You affect one thing that could depress or accelerate something else, and this model helps you to see some of those dynamic interactions. That's the real power of it. And it's been tested against the best science we have globally, that all of the simulations, they've run them against the huge global integrated climate models to test them, to see if the answers that come out of this simulation make sense with the best science that we have. And they've got hundreds of pages of documentation of that for anyone who wants to dive deep. So what we'll be doing tonight is looking at the simulator, and it's pretty intuitive. And these equations that get solved are in 60 milliseconds. So you can propose a policy change, and these 15,000 equations get solved in 60 milliseconds and give you an answer. That's the real kind of real-time feel to the simulator. And so we can use it to look at various scenarios, various policy scenarios, and get an experience of the interactions amongst those policy levers. And the real goal for climate interaction, and I think for us too, is to use the simulator to facilitate conversations about climate. Conversations within our families, conversations with friends and neighbors. I've done that, invited the people in my block in to come and spend an evening with some coffee and cake and walk through this and facilitate a conversation with them. And for CCL, it's particularly powerful to have a conversation with our members of parliament, provincial parliaments, and their staffers. So in Toronto East, we've used this simulator. We've taken it into a meeting with my member of parliament from Beaches East York. We've taken it into a meeting with a member of provincial parliament from Toronto Danforth. And both of those folks were taken with it immediately. As I said, it's quite visual and it's quite engaging that way. So I'd encourage you to make use of it this way too with your friends and neighbors. And if you want to get more knowledgeable about it, there's a training course that En-ROADS offers. The first one was done in January, and they've recorded it, so the 8 sessions for that are online. You can do it yourself. But if you'd like a bit more interaction, they are shortly, I think in May, going to do another training session. So it's 8 sessions of an hour each to become very familiar with the tool itself. So I'll introduce you to the screen and start to walk you through what you see with this simulator. So I need to share my screen here. So can everyone see this? These lines, colored lines? Okay. So we'll start over here. And this is the business as usual case. Here in 2020, we're a bit over 1 degree Celsius above pre-industrial levels of global average temperature. And with business as usual, if we do nothing more than what's happening now, the big global models are saying we're going to be somewhere around 4 degrees Celsius warmer by the end of the century. And I think most of us in CCL know what kind of a catastrophe that would represent. Sea levels rising, more desertification, more floods, more powerful hurricanes, a lot of things we don't want. But if we continue on a business as usual course, this is where we're headed, something around a 4 degree temperature range. So the Paris Agreement, amongst those 197 nations, perhaps -1 if the US does pull out, said that we need to limit global temperature rise to 2 degrees Celsius at the most, and an aspirational level of 1.5 degrees, which is not far beyond where we are already. With business as usual, we'll be at 1.5 degrees by 2030, if not sooner, and we'll certainly be well on our way to 4 degrees. So the goal of our conversation tonight, and the ones that you may have in future, is say, what could we do to avoid this scenario? What can we do to avoid global temperatures rising to that kind of a level? And so some of the things that contribute to that temperature rise is our energy use. And there's a number of sources of energy, primary energy around the planet. This brown line represents the amount of our energy that's coming out of coal. And in a business as usual case, there's a lot of coal around, and it's pretty cheap at present prices. And if we do nothing different, the world is going to continue to meet its energy demands largely from coal. A second big source of energy is oil. That's the red line here. It does eventually peak. So at some point, the price of drilling deeper and deeper and further is going to start to limit the usefulness of oil. But it's a long way out. It could be as late as 2060 before we hit peak oil on a business as usual case. Natural gas is also rising quite steadily. Some of it's substituting for coal, but not a lot of it. It's still, in some jurisdictions, more expensive than coal. But it's certainly a primary source of greenhouse gas emissions. The green line here is renewables: sun, wind, solar, tidal, geothermal, all sorts of, and they are rising. And even in a business as usual case, in some jurisdictions, they're already cost competitive with fossil fuels. And the price continues to drop. And so we will continue, even in a business as usual case, to see an increase in the use of renewables, but nowhere near as much as the energy that's coming from fossil fuels. Biomass is another somewhat problematic source of energy today. Some enthuse about it, some have become much less enthralled about it. There's issues around biomass. But on a business as usual case, it's growing and will continue to grow. And nuclear is small in a global sense, and is likely to continue to rise in a business as usual case. And so one thing I should say at the outset here is this model is a global model. So it's imagining the whole planet. And so this is the whole planet's consumption of oil and the whole planet's consumption of coal. So there are economies that have largely gone away from coal, but there are other economies that are heavily into coal, and developing countries that are using more and more coal for their own economic growth. So it's a global model that we're looking at. Now, another way of looking at these energy sources is where the greenhouse gases are coming from. And so this graph shows us that this black area is the amount of, we're looking at greenhouse gas emissions for the whole planet, and it's in gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalent. And so this black area is all of the greenhouse gases that are coming from energy production, the CO2 from energy production. So that's burning coal, oil, gas. That's what this big black area is. The green area is the amount of greenhouse gases that are coming from changes in land use. And that's primarily from deforestation. And so we're and also from primarily deforestation. And this yellow band is the amount of carbon dioxide equivalent that's coming from F gases. These are the fluorocarbons that are used primarily in refrigeration and some industrial processes. And this blue band, light blue band, is the amount of greenhouse gases that are coming from methane sources. So that's both land use, agriculture, and waste, and also from natural gas production and distribution. And the final little bit here is nitrous oxides, primarily from agriculture and also from automobile exhaust. So these are the things that are contributing to greenhouse gases, which are then driving this 4-degree temperature rise. And we're looking at a level of perhaps 60 gigatons globally, and up to 120 gigatons, doubling by the end of the century. And why is that? So the things that are driving this growth in greenhouse gas production are firstly population. So our current population is around 7.5 billion people. And that's likely to peak out at somewhere between 10.5 and 11 billion people on current projections. And each of those persons is participating, or many, in economic growth. So that the gross domestic product per capita is rising from a current global average of about $20,000. It could be close to $60,000 per capita by the end of the century. And so more people and more GDP per capita is a real driver of the production of greenhouse gases. Within that, the energy intensity of GDP is declining. We are becoming more efficient in the use of even the fossil fuels. And secondly, economies are shifting more towards service economies, which are less energy intensive. So we are getting a bit of a benefit from a reduction in energy intensity. And the carbon content of that is also dropping slightly with an increasing bit of renewables and nuclear in the mix. But the total still comes out to a bad news case, that the CO2 emissions from energy use are going up from the current level of about 40 gigatons to this 80 gigatons. And so the fact that we're doubling the amount of carbon dioxide emissions from energy production is what's contributing to this global 4-degree temperature rise on a business as usual case. So that's what we want to find ways away from. So down below here are 18 different policy levers, things that could reduce the amount of greenhouse gas production and therefore the global temperature rise that goes with us. For example, coal. We could tax coal, or we could subsidize coal some more, even more than it is already. Or we could even shut down coal production, or use of coal for energy production at some point in the near or distant future. So we've got some policy options here around the use of coal. Similar options for the use of oil. We can tax it lightly or heavily. We could remove subsidies or add more subsidies. And we can stop building new oil infrastructure. So that's a policy option for us. Similarly for these other energy supply options, nuclear, or even some new technology. People have dreamed about thorium fission for a long time, or even nuclear fusion, harness the energy process that the sun uses. So maybe we'll have a breakthrough in new technologies that could help us with our greenhouse gas problems. Then over here in the efficiency sector, in transport, we could have more energy efficiency in transport. There, for example, more mass transit, more cycling and walking, or we could have electrification of existing transport. Similarly with buildings and industry, both personal dwellings as well as industrial buildings and offices. We could be using that space more efficiently, and there could be more use of electric heat sources, for example, instead of fossil fuel furnaces in factories. Population growth we saw was a driver for greenhouse gas emissions. So we could have a slower population growth, or perhaps population growth would even accelerate. Similarly with economic growth, we could have slower economic growth, or we could have accelerated economic growth to affect greenhouse gas emissions. And over here in land and industry uses, we could reduce the extent of deforestation that's happening. We could increase the amount of forestry, forest plantings that are happening. And methane emissions, there's two primary sources, from agriculture and food use. And the second is from natural gas production and distribution. So we could be reducing the methane emissions associated with either of those activities. And finally, carbon removal technologies. There are a number of interesting technologies under development. One is the production of biochar that can go into agricultural soils and kind of sequester it there. There's the direct air capture, where you suck carbon out of the atmosphere, literally, and liquefy it and sequester it. And there's some other technologies in that area. So these are all the options we have available to us tonight for this conversation. So what I'd like you to do now is think about what one or two things would you think would be most effective and that we should be thinking about trying or have a look at what this simulation would suggest for it? So if you could put it in the chat room, something you think we should look at as a policy option, maybe something that's even more likely now coming out of the COVID crisis, or something that's just so important we have to do it regardless. So put those in the chat room and we'll start to play with it, see what kind of results we get. And Laura's going to monitor that for us and let us know what you're seeing there, Laura.
Okay, we have a few ideas coming in, great ideas. Just wait for a couple more. Okay, so we have carbon price, not surprising, Doug.
Imagine that.
Imagine. Afforestation, population reduction, reduction in economic growth, increasing renewables, all great ideas. Shifting to active transport, energy efficient homes, more carbon price, energy efficiency. So some good ideas there. Energy efficiency, afforestation, carbon pricing.
Great, okay, those are great ideas. Okay, well, being Citizens Climate Lobby, I guess we should start with carbon pricing, right?
Let's do that.
So CCL's current policy is pushing us further. The federal, the PanCanadian Framework on Climate Change is talking about a $10 a ton rise. We're at 30 now. We'll be at 50 by 2022. No word from the feds as to what's going to happen after that, whether it's going to continue to rise at $10 a ton or more or less or freeze. But CCL is saying we need to move faster than that. And we're proposing a price of $210 a ton by 2030. So that would put us right up about here on this particular slider. So if we do that, and this is looking at the whole planet, we're not just talking about Canada here, although we're aware of what Canada is pushing. If the whole planet introduced a carbon price that got up as high as $210 a ton carbon equivalent by the year 2030, 10 years from now, we pushed it up to $210 within the next 10 years. What do you think that would do to this projected temperature increase? It's going to come down. How far is it going to come down? Could you put that in the chat room? What you think it might do? And we'll have a look.
Two guesses so far. Keep them coming.
We're going to come down half a degree. We're going to come down 4 degrees. Not much at all. What's your guess? Carbon price.
I have a winner.
Okay.
I would say the average guess is 3.0.
3.0. Okay. So if we
3.1, 3.2, 3.8, but most 3.0.
Okay. So if we have a carbon price of $210 a ton, let's now, these three little dots here beside each of the levers takes you into a lot more information here. So you've got a space here where you can put in the carbon price directly. If you want, you can get into even more detail down here. I won't do that tonight with you folks, but there's a lot more options you can put in there. The simplest is to just put in a price of $210 here. Whoops, let's make it the full amount. The other thing you'll see over here, it'll give you a graph of what the carbon price is. And you've also got some information here. And each of these sliders, you get a lot more information about what this particular slider is about, how it operates, some co-benefits, and also some equity considerations of the carbon price. So we'll come back to a bit of that in a minute. So if we enter this carbon price of $210 a ton, we're on the mark. We got a temperature drop from 4.1 forecast to 3.0. So we've got a big change in the scenario with a high carbon price. We can get down to 3 degrees. And what's moving as we get there? This is something to have a look at. We'll go back and forth. So here we are at the 4.1, now 3.0. And so one of the things that's moving a lot is this brown line. So that's coal. So the amount of coal that's being used here drops dramatically. when we start to put a high price on carbon. So that's not a big surprise. We do see a bit of a dip in the blue line, which is natural gas. So it comes down as well. Not as far as the coal does, because coal is far more carbon intense. It's much more subject to carbon pricing, but natural gas is as well to a lesser extent. One line that doesn't move very much is the red line. So that's oil. So it does come down, but not nearly as fast or as far as the coal line does. So oil has some sensitivity to that carbon price, especially a high carbon price. And we see a growth in renewables. So renewables are up here. Now, one of the concerns from this, we've achieved a lot here in bringing our carbon price down, or the projected temperature down to 3 degrees only. But it does come at a cost. So if you look here at the cost of energy, it's now shot up from $25 a gigajoule to $45 a gigajoule. So we've almost doubled the cost of energy. And that's going to have some equity considerations. So for people that are on a limited income, to suddenly have their energy costing them nearly twice as much. Sure, there's a benefit for the planet in limiting global warming, but how are you going to pay your bills day to day? So that's one of the equity considerations that goes with this. And when you get into some of this information here, they'll start to talk about some of these equity considerations. So companies are going to pass on the cost of the energy that they're experiencing, and householders are also going to experience higher energy costs in their own heating bills. So CCL's solution to that, of course, is to take all the money from this carbon price and return it to households to address that equity concern. So in each of these policy levers, it's helpful to look at what are some of the co-benefits. Just have a think about that. What are some of the additional benefits of having a high carbon price? So one of the costs is the higher energy, but what's a benefit in your mind? And put that in the chat room. Some benefits you would see of having a high carbon price. Besides, reducing global warming, what are some other things that go along with it that could be beneficial to us? What are you seeing there, Laura?
A diversified green economy. People will adjust their energy use, so we'd have decreased consumption.
Mm-hmm.
It would stimulate alternate energy startups, which would be great. Reducing air pollution, that's a good one. Healthier environment. Income inequality could decrease. Lots of great co-benefits.
So a lot of co-benefits with that carbon price in addition to its impact on global warming. Okay, so we're halfway there almost, from 4.1 down to halfway to 2 degrees. It's still a bit of a stretch to get down to 1.5 degrees. So what are some other things that we could talk about that I think, Laura, one of the ones you mentioned was energy efficiency, was it?
Yes.
And was
there
that
was energy efficiency mentioned in both industry and in transport.
Okay, all right. So let's have a look at industry, energy efficiency, and some of the things that are included in that are shown here in these little dots. So individuals and businesses could be insulating their buildings, purchasing energy efficiency technologies, more efficient motors, more efficient lighting like LED lighting, more efficient appliances and equipment for their factories or homes. So these are some of the energy efficiency opportunities within homes and businesses. So if we go back to our slider here, and if we crank up the energy efficiency significantly, what we see here is a slight reduction of another 0.2 degrees. And which are the lines that move? So we see the amount of renewable energy goes down, and the amount of natural gas used goes down, and even coal goes down a bit, and nuclear. So all of these things are going down because we're more efficient. We don't need as much of energy from any source. And so it impacts all of these. One line that didn't move very much is the red line. So with improved energy efficiency in buildings, we're not seeing any change in oil consumption. And that's because most oil is going into transportation, whether it's truck transport, private automobiles, airplanes, ships. So most of the oil is going into transportation. So if we addressed transportation efficiency as well, as you suggested, then we should start to see a move in the red line. And sure enough, we can get a drop in that red line down to with increased energy efficiency in the transport sector. But it didn't take us down a lot globally. And part of the problem with both of these efficiency levers is that it takes some time. That buildings have a lot of equipment already installed, and to replace it with more efficient equipment is a good thing and will be beneficial, but it's going to take a while before you get there. Similarly with vehicles, you may have a more efficient car or truck, but you're going to wait until your current one claps out. And so there's a significant time delay in introducing these new technologies. Things like a carbon price hit the fossil fuels on the head right away. Like right from the day you put that carbon price in, coal consumption starts to drop. But energy efficiency and in transport or buildings takes a while to come into effect. By the time we get to the end of the century, it's helped a lot. But in the short term, it's not helping us as much as we might like. Important to do it. It got us down from 3 degrees to 2.7, but it's taking a while. What's another one on your list there, Laura?
Let's put a big investment behind renewables. Lots of people want to support renewables.
Okay, so if we move this up, and we're going to have a big increase in renewables. So this is a measure of a subsidy here, is what we're getting here. So if we put a big subsidy on renewables, watch what it's doing for us. Okay, so it hasn't moved our temperature at all. It's changed the mix a bit. So it's brought down the blue line a little bit. It's brought down the coal line a little bit, and the green line goes up a bit quicker. But it hasn't had as big an impact as we might have expected. Oops, I need to go back to our, there we are, our big subsidy. And part of the explanation with that is that we've already taken a big whack at the fossil fuels with the carbon price. So people have already moved to renewables in a significant way because of the price now of fossil fuels. And even putting more money into renewables by way of subsidies is a bit helpful. Took us down maybe half a degree, or sorry, not even 0.1 of a degree, a bit less than that, by getting renewables in a little bit quicker. But again, there's a lead time here. It hasn't affected much by 2030. By 2040, it's moved things up significantly by 2040. But that's still a 20-year lag before you've got, even with heavy subsidies, before you've got a lot of renewables out there replacing fossil fuels. So these newer technologies all have a lag time, and it sort of speaks to the power of the existing infrastructure. And the more of it you build, the more of it's going to be around for 40 or 50 years. It's a bit of the curse we've got here.
Okay, Doug, I'll give you a list of some of the other great ideas, and then you can decide
Okay.
which ones you want to do first. So we have some votes for afforestation.
Oh, right, yes. Mm-hmm.
Planting some more trees. We have cut economic growth.
Okay.
We have lower population growth, electrification of transport, and reduction in methane.
Okay.
All good ideas.
Right, and that latter one's an interesting one. When we look here at the source of the greenhouse gas emissions, so we had this graph at the outset where everything was going up as in the business as usual case. So now we've knocked down this black area quite substantially, and that's the amount of carbon dioxide equivalent that's coming from energy production. So with knocking down coal-fired power plants and natural gas-fired power plants, and some reduction in oil in the transport sector, we've taken quite a big hit out of the greenhouse gases coming from energy production. But one thing that's actually hasn't shrunk at all, in fact, it's even grown a bit, is this light blue bar, and that's methane. So to this point, we haven't touched methane production at all. And so if we have a look here at this methane slider, there's a couple of sources of methane. If we get into the detailed settings here, there's methane coming from agricultural and from waste, both food waste and other municipal wastes. And there's also methane coming from the energy industry, either production of natural gas and distribution of natural gas. Those we can reduce either of those individually or together. The simplest here is just to look at it together. So if we had, say, a 50% reduction in methane, and that's a tall order to cut methane emissions in half from agriculture and from industry, then you can have quite a significant impact with that. Let's enter that. Wow. So that knocked us down from 2.7 to 2.2. So that's a huge reduction in greenhouse gas emissions with attacking methane sources. And it's challenging to get a 50% reduction. That might be optimistic to do that in both agriculture. That's the whole planet switching to a much more plant-based diet, and also a significant reduction in natural gas production and distribution. But it does knock down then this methane bar here from perhaps almost 20 gigatons to probably closer to 5 gigatons coming from methane. And we're within the grasp of our 2.0 targets and perhaps a chance to get below it. So let's have a look at, I think you mentioned forestation was another area. Our own government's talking about planting more trees. Lots of people want to plant trees. So if we plant a whole pile of trees, then what's that going to do for us? It should help us with this land use area, this green bar here, which is contributing some greenhouse gases. Can we start to take some of that out? And sure enough, we now started to dip below the zero for the green line. So those trees are starting to take some of that carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere on a net basis, but it hasn't really much touched our total greenhouse gas or temperature rise by the century end by very much. And the reason for that is similar to some of our other technology issues back here. It takes a long time to grow a tree. You could be looking at 20 or 30 years in the temperate zone, maybe a bit less in the tropical zones, before that tree is going to be sucking a significant amount of carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. So there are a lot of other benefits to more tree planting. Why don't you name some of those in the chat room? Even if we haven't knocked down our temperature much with tree planting, what are some co-benefits? What are some other good things that happen with more tree planting?
Just enter in the chat what you think are some of the
What are some co-benefits of planting more trees, in addition to getting a bit of a benefit here in carbon removals? What are some other benefits from planting trees?
So we're going to protect biodiversity. We're going to have shade trees to help help some of that effect in cities of heat and adapt to the higher temperatures. More habitat, shade in cities, wildlife habitat. Another vote for biodiversity. Cleaner air, for sure. Less soil erosion. Wow, they're all coming now.
Great.
So
Okay. Great
there are
idea.
a lot of
Great.
co-benefits. Better mental health.
Right. Right. Yeah. Who wouldn't like to go for a walk in the forest now?
Exactly. Those are
Right.
great, everybody.
Yeah. So some of these policy initiatives have, very significant co-benefits in addition to their impact on global warming. I think we didn't talk about electrification of transport. Someone has mentioned that. So if we start to incentivize transport, we're going to get some benefits. Takes us down to 2.1. And if we also have more electrification of heating in buildings and the motors that are used in factories, well, there we are. We're down to 2 degrees, and with this scenario. And this carbon removal technology, there's a lot of hopes for that. It's still at pretty early stages for it, but if some of those biochar projects or mineralization projects or direct air capture, we're able to, even with low growth in that technology, we can pull ourselves down to 1.8 degrees. So we did it, folks. We did it. We got ourselves well below 2 degrees Celsius, but it wasn't with just one policy. It wasn't even with CCL's favorite policy of carbon pricing. That got us halfway there. But to get any further, we need a lot of other things. And En-ROADS kind of uses the analogy of planting a garden. You don't plant a garden with one seed. You're going to need multiple seeds to get this garden to be productive and diverse and a healthy garden. So we had to do quite a number of things, helping renewables, efficiencies and electrification in the transport and building sector. Methane emissions were a big one. They had a big impact, probably second only to carbon pricing when we attacked methane. Forestation had didn't actually have a big impact on how much, and this is an interesting one. If you compare Project Drawdown, I think they have reduced deforestation and more planting of forests as kind of their top single policy. And in terms of the gigatons of carbon that you can remove with massive tree planting, it is quite significant, but it's going to take you 30 years to get there. So they're right that you can achieve a lot of carbon removal with forestation, but for our purposes, it's going to come too late. We're going to be well on our track to a high temperature increase before those forests are mature enough to contribute positively. So we're needing some more short-term things that are in our hands now in terms of carbon pricing, some work in efficiencies here, even though there's a bit of a time lag there too, and certainly addressing methane. So here's a scenario that is really a positive one for us. And what I'd like us to do is just sit with this scenario for 60 seconds and just imagine what kind of world this would be. What would you love about this world that was on track to a temperature increase still by century end, but a lot less than the business as usual case. A world that had more forests, more energy efficiency and electrification, had a carbon price, and with CCL's dividend as well. So I'm going to time this for 60 seconds. And then what I'd like you to do when I call time is to put into the chat room what you particularly would like about this world scenario. Okay, 60 seconds and counting. Okay, that's 60 seconds. What would you love about a world that looked like this particular scenario that we put together tonight in this conversation? So put that in the chat room. Something you would love about this world. And we get Laura to read them back to us as you put them in.
There are already some fantastic thoughts in here, Doug. So children have a future. We'd have peace and quiet, less guilt, less pollution, slower economic growth, more parks, more recreation, safer and healthier future for my grandkids, go back to a normal retirement. What is that anyway? Freedom from fear. That's a good one too.
Yeah.
I mean, very powerful emotions, clean air, able to see the stars, have more insects, more bees, more butterflies, satisfaction of taking care of each other, taking care of the planet, healthier children, more bikeable cities, comfort of knowing that my fellow human beings care for nature, including ourselves, and a world that wildlife can adapt to. And here's a powerful one. We still have a world.
Right. Yeah.
So,
yeah.
Really good thoughts.
Okay. Well, thank you. Well, yeah. And none of this is rocket science down here. I mean, we have all of this. The only thing that's new is some low growth in the carbon capture technology in this scenario. Everything else is in our hands. We've already got a carbon price starting. We can accelerate that. We already know how to seal leaks in our buildings and how to make reduce energy use in our homes and our transport. We've already got electric cars and buses on the road, and trucks are coming. So none of this is out of our grasp at all. So that's the good news with this scenario. Another thing that En-ROADS talks about, we've touched on these co-benefits as we've gone along tonight, and you've named several more even in this final session. And the En-ROADS folks, can you see this flower in your screen? So they kind of summarize it with a concept they call multi-solving. So you're solving the climate crisis problem, but you're doing it with some multiple benefits. So it can be benefits in jobs, like the renewable energy sector tends to need a lot more workers than the capital intensive fossil fuel sector. So promoting renewables helps to promote job growth. We've talked a fair bit about health and well-being already tonight, being able to breathe the air and less air pollution from some of these initiatives that we've taken. Connection with each other, or even connection with nature, and being able to enjoy that. Changes within the energy industry as workers are retrained and move from one sector to another sector. Resilience, by having some of these policies in place, we're going to be much more resilient and less vulnerable to storms and floods and other threats to our environment. And changing our food, often reducing the meat consumption in a diet is a healthier diet. And so you've got changes, and also you've got changes in water use. Coal mining uses a lot of water, and mining the tar sands also uses a lot of water. So we can protect our water resources as another problem that's solved by addressing this climate crisis in the way we talked about here tonight. So let me go back to our scenario here. Oops, no, it's gone. Okay. One last thing I might just touch on for CCL's purpose here tonight is the PanCanadian Framework on Climate Change has a number of initiatives in it, which include a modest carbon price, and hopefully it'll continue to rise, but that hasn't been guaranteed yet. It does address a number of things, and I put them together into this simulator. And this is something you might be able to take into a conversation with one of your legislators. So here it is. So just to walk through it, we've got a modest carbon price here of $50 a ton by the year 2022, and no guarantees it's going to increase yet. But with that $50 a ton price, it's had some impact already. Another thing that's in the policy is to phase out coal-fired power plants by the year 2030. So you can see here, by the year 2030, there's no more coal-fired power in Canada. So if the whole planet did that, this is what it would look like. The Pan-Canadian Framework also talks about increased energy efficiency, both in transport sector and in the building sector. So those are key. And then the final thing that the Pan-Canadian Framework talks about is a reduction in methane emissions from energy and industry of 45%. It's silent on agriculture, which is an interesting omission in my mind. But they're talking about a 45% reduction in the industrial methane emissions. Now, a couple of other things our government has announced is they keep saying they're going to reduce the subsidies for fossil fuels. It hasn't happened yet, but that would be equivalent to a small tax instead on coal, oil, and natural gas. So that's, and bioenergy. So that's part of the government's policy at the moment, although not its practice. And the government's also announced a significant afforestation project. So if we do all of these things in the Pan-Canadian Framework, plus these other couple of things on fossil fuel subsidies and forestation, that brings us down to 2.7 degrees. So if the whole planet did what Canada's doing in the Pan-Canadian Framework, we would get to 2.7 degrees, but no further. So it's not good enough. But it's fairly easily addressed, I found, that if we crank that price, the carbon price up significantly, if we go to the methane emissions, we also have, say, 25% reduction in methane emissions from agriculture and from food. That gets us down. And then if we have some carbon removal technologies, then we can get down to 2 degrees. So it's kind of helpful for conversations with legislators that the Pan-Canadian Framework only takes us to 2.7 degrees, but three other things can get us further. Keep cranking up the carbon price, get some methane reductions in the agriculture sector as well, and perhaps some new technologies for carbon capture. So that's a quick run through the En-ROADS simulator. You can become an En-ROADS ambassador and become much more knowledgeable about some of the background to each of these policy levers and how they interact with one another by doing that course, the online course that's coming up, or do the ones that are already on their website that you can pace at your own, take at your own pace. So you could become an En-ROADS ambassador and feel even more confident going in. But even, as I said, this tool is quite intuitive, and it shows fairly quickly the interaction and the extent of the policy changes that need to be made. It's not, you've got to plant this garden. You're not going to do it with just one or another policy alone. So I'd encourage you to consider taking it into your next meeting with your members of parliament, provincial, or even local city councils. I think folks would be drawn to it quite quickly and easily. So my final question for you tonight for the chat room is, what's one thing that you would take away from tonight? Something you might do that's different or that you'll keep doing in the light of the conversation we've had here tonight, either immediately or even over the next year or two or three, as we emerge from the current crisis and continue working to avoid the next crisis. So if you could put into the chat room, what's one thing that you want to put more emphasis on or take up for the first time as a result of our conversation over the last hour?
I love some of these. Can I start reading them?
Sure. That's
So write more frequently to MPs about increased carbon pricing, encourage more friends and families to a plant-based diet, buying my first electric vehicle this fall. Excellent. Broaden our focus, reducing transportation based on fossil fuels, reducing my meat consumption. Lots of the learning about ways to reduce methane, support children's climate movements. Fantastic. Great
Okay,
action.
great. Okay, well, go for it. We can do it. It's all in our hands here, and we've got a tool that can help us run a few simulations. We'll put in the chat room just what the where you can get a hold of this this free tool. So it's just n-roads.org, and you're right onto their website, and you can get this simulator for yourself, and it's easy to run, it's intuitive, and behind each of these triple dots you've got lots of information of how the that particular policy lever is working, and the little I gives you all of the information, examples of it, equity considerations, what the range of the slider is that they're using. So it's pretty intuitive. And if you want to go deeper, take their course. So thank you all tonight. We will be Kathy will send you a link to the recording if you want to see more, and we'll include the chat room as well, so the links that Laura's put up into the chat room will be there for you as well. If you have any questions that didn't get addressed tonight or that occur to you after, please contact me either through Kathy or directly, and we'll see if we can get you an answer. If I can't answer it, the En-ROADS folks have been very responsive to questions. They really want to support all of us that are using this tool. So thanks for your time tonight, and go for it.
You're getting lots of thank yous and lots of kudos in the chat. So I think everyone really enjoyed it. Thank you all for coming.
Yeah, and if you know a group that would like to have this, Laura's a trained ambassador. Chris is going to be soon. I am already. So any one of us could help run it for you. But we'd encourage you to consider getting the qualification yourself and the confidence to use it. Okay. Good night, all.
Good night. Thank you. Mara, you